It's not a microphone for tall. I want to just explain, before I introduce Dr. Akçam, what the next couple of hours will contain. As Nina said, we will accept questions in writing from the audience after Dr. Akçam's talk. This isn't necessarily everyone's favorite way of handling question and answer, but it's necessary to keep things moving along. We will then welcome you to purchase copies of Dr. Akçam's books, which are for sale in the lobby out there, and I'm sure he will kindly sign them for you, as long as his hand permits him to. 3 years ago, this same group of co-sponsors presented a talk by Dr. Akçam here at Harvard when his previous book, From Empire to Republic, was published. I remember that evening very well, and I'm sure many of you were in attendance. And I remember how pleased and moved I was that a serious scholarly presentation was given and received by the audience in a like spirit of respect. Not everyone agreed with what Dr. Akçam had to say, and I expect not everyone will agree with him tonight. We are all aware that there are deep and occasionally volatile disagreements on this subject. All we ask is that when you present your opinions or your questions, it's presented in a spirit of respect and a spirit of scholarship. Tonight's lecture is not a political rally. It is a presentation of Dr. Akçam's research. So let us go forward in that spirit. Dr. Taner Akçam is visiting associate professor of history at the University of Minnesota, a position he has held since 2002. He was born in Ardahan province in Turkey, received his doctorate from the University of Hanover in Germany in 1995. He has written and lectured extensively all over the world about the Armenian Genocide. He is the author of the English language titles Dialogue Across an International Divide, Essays Towards a Turkish-Armenian Dialogue, From Empire to Republic, Turkish Nationalism and the Armenian Genocide, and most recently, of course, A Shameful Act, the Armenian Genocide and the Question of Turkish Responsibility, as well as other works in Turkish and in German. He has most recently written 2 very significant articles published in English in the new journal, Genocide Studies and Prevention, a few copies of which are also available tonight. These articles draw almost entirely on Ottoman archival sources, and along with similar work being carried out by other scholars, sound the death knell for the old canard that there is no evidence implicating the Ottoman leadership in the Armenian Genocide. So please welcome tonight Dr. Taner Akçam. Let me just mention there are a couple of seats down in the front here. Is anyone using these seats here? There's one free seat here, and the rest of you, we beg your forbearance and thank you for squeezing in.
So, good evening. Thank you, Mark, for very kind introduction, and thanks to all organizations for inviting me here. It is a pleasure to share with you my new book, A Shameful Act. What I'm going to do is following. My speech has 2 main bodies. In the first part, I will give some general information about the book, what are the topics that I covered in my book, and so on. And in the second part, I will dwell on a very important point. I think it has certain relevance regarding the Turkish state policy, which I call denial as a security concept. The national security concept of Turkey and denial as a part of this national security concept. And I try to analyze in the second part of my speech to show you the importance of the concept of national security and the importance of Armenian genocide. This will be the second part of my speech. Now, first, some general information about the book. National memories, highly selective. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, Iraq, Syria, indeed, all countries established on Ottoman soil remember their histories as a series of expulsion and massacres inflicted on them by the others. Turkey, likewise, remembers massacres of Muslims by Armenians, Greeks, Bulgarians, and other ethnic groups. As a rule, if you read the history books, all communities, whether national, religious, or cultural, tend to remember the suffering they have endured. They do not remember the wrongs they themselves have inflicted. Turkey does not remember the suffering that Muslims inflicted on Christians, in particular the Armenian Genocide. My book, A Shameful Act, breaks with this tradition. It is a call to the people of Turkey to consider the suffering inflicted in their name. The reason for this call is not only the scale of the Armenian Genocide, which was in no way comparable to the individual act of revenge carried out against Muslims after 1917-18. It is also because all studies of large-scale atrocities teach us one core principle. To prevent the recurrence of similar events, people must first consider their own responsibility, discuss it, debate it, and recognize it. Without such honest consideration, there remains the high probability of such act being repeated, since every group, regardless, every group is inherently capable of violence. When the right conditions arise, this potential can easily become reality, and on the slightest of pretext, there are no exceptions. When Europe received the news of the Armenian massacres, England, France, and Russia issued a joint declaration dated May 24, 1915. The declaration read, quote, "In view of these crimes of Turkey against humanity and civilization, the Allied governments announced publicly to the Sublime Porte, the Istanbul government, that they will hold personally responsible for these crimes all members of the Ottoman government and those of their agents who are implicated in such massacre." End quote. This is how the phrase crime against humanity entered international law. The Allied powers had promised to bring the perpetrators to justice. After the Allies' victory in World War I and the death of some 1 million Armenians, it soon became clear that this would not be an easy task. Many of those who had committed the genocide went underground, where some of them took leading roles in their national movement against Allied occupation. Meanwhile, the Allies themselves had competing political interests in the region. Finally, and most important, there was no precedent within international law to prosecute crime against humanity. Nevertheless, 3 attempts were made to try and punish the guilty. This is the topic of A Shameful Act. The first was a series of court-martials set up by the Ottoman government in Istanbul. These military courts, which began their pre-trial interrogations in November 1918, began hearing cases in February 1919 of the following year and continued until 1922. The records of these trials includes indictments, telegrams, eyewitness accounts, and other testimony, primarily from senior officers and military officers and governors, all of which helped to document and establish responsibility for the Armenian Genocide. You will read a lot of documents from these trials in my book. The second attempt was initiated by the Allied power at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference with the ultimate goal of prosecuting crimes against humanity in an international court. This effort was derailed partly by Allied conflict of interest and partly by the fact that no international law applied to crimes perpetrated by a state against its own people. It is not a coincidence, maybe. It was the United States basically blocked this process in Paris, like they blocked today the International Criminal Court. Their argument was a law argument. It's a very well-known argument. None of the new developed rules can be applicable retrospectively. This was the American resistance in 1919, so there were no international tribunal in Paris. Although the Treaty of Sevres provided for the prosecution of war criminals under international law, those provisions were not enforced because the Turkish national movement repudiated the Sevres Treaty. Great Britain made the final attempt to bring war criminals to justice. This effort failed because the evidence in the American and British archives was insufficient to convict specific individuals in the custody of Britain, even though ample evidence against individuals did exist in the Ottoman archives. There were no cooperation in that regard between British government and the Ottoman government. It is a very important program or PhD topic for a graduate student, why Britain never asked the Ottoman authorities for these documents in their archives. In 1948, you will read all these three attempts and history of all these three attempts in my book in details. In 1948, after the Holocaust, the United Nations first defined genocide as a crime under international law, and the most crucial element in this definition is the intent to destroy a people as such. Therefore, the heated controversy about Turkish responsibility boils down to one basic question. Still today, it's the basic question. Is there evidence of intent and central planning on the part of the Ottoman authorities for the total or partial destruction of the Armenians as a people? The official Turkish position is that the death of hundreds of thousands of Armenians was tragic but unintended byproduct of the war. This argument rests on the claim that there is no reliable evidence of a deliberate policy of systematic killing. According to official view, the only source of reliable evidence is the Prime Ministerial Archives in Istanbul, what we call Başbakanlık Arşivi. Foreign archives, American, British, German, and Austrian, as well as the domestic proceeding of Istanbul court-martial, are dismissed as politically motivated distortions of the events. In A Shameful Act, I demonstrated for the first time that all these sources are consistent with each other. The Prime Ministerial Archive, the Foreign Archives, and the Istanbul court-martial all tell the same story, but from different perspectives. They confirm that the ruling Union and Progress Party, also known as the Young Turks, did deliberately attempt to destroy the Armenian population, as Interior Minister Talat told to German Consul Mortman, quote, "What we are talking about is the elimination of the Armenians," end quote. It is important to note that the decision for genocide did not originate in the Ottoman government, because the bureaucracy contained pockets of resistance against the ruling Union and Progress Party. Instead, the sources that we have indicate that the Union and Progress Party Central Committee, most likely at the end of March 1915, decided to remove Armenians from their homes to be killed. This genocidal plan, later adopted as a government policy, was intended to guarantee the territorial integrity of the empire and to eliminate the related and long-standing Armenian question once and for all. There is a very important document. This is hardly used in Turkish sources also, even though if you look the Turkish books published by mostly the authors who support the Turkish thesis, you can find a reference to that document. This is an official letter written by Talat Pasha, 26 May 1915. He wrote a lengthy letter, almost if you transcribe into modern Turkish or English, it is 4 or 5 pages a letter. He tries to explain the policy of the Ottoman government, and in this letter we learn the main policy of the Union and Progress Party and the government. It is very important, this document, because we haven't published this in entirety in none of the languages we have. I have this and plan to publish in all entirety. In this document, if you read why Talat explains that Armenian had to be deported, you will read no one single word related to war. War is not reason for the deportation. In his letter, he says, beginning of the war, we took some temporary measures to solve this issue, but it was not enough. Now it is time to solve this issue. Now I'm quoting from his letter. He wrote 1915, 26 May, quote, the necessary preparation have been discussed and taken for the complete and fundamental elimination of this concern, the Armenian, which occupies an important place in the exalted state's list of vital issues. And in the document, he made a summary of Armenian reform problem beginning of end of 19th century. For him, the basic problem was the Armenian reform issue. And this issue must be solved because it gives the Allied power opportunity to intervene the domestic affairs of the Ottoman Empire, and it is against the national security interest of the state. So this is the important connection, national security policy of Ottomans and national security policy of today's Turkey. So, not only did the Union and Progress Party intend to destroy the Armenians as a people, the Armenian genocide was also not an isolated aberration. It should be understood as a part of a larger demographic policy of the Ottoman Turkish authorities in response to ongoing disintegration of the empire. After the shocking defeat in Balkan War 1912-13, when the Ottomans lost more than 60% of their European territory, the authorities came to believe that it was impossible to live side by side with the empire's remaining Christian population, or even worse, that the Ottoman Christians posed a threat to empire's very survival. Therefore, the Ottoman authorities, beginning of 1913, adopted a policy of homogenizing the population of Anatolia and the territorial heart of the empire. This demographic policy had two main components. First, to assimilate non-Turkish Muslims by dispersing them among the Turkish majority. This means during that period, Bosnians, Albanians, immigrants from Caucasus, Kurds, Arabs, all Muslim population, non-Turkic element of Anatolia relocated, dispersed throughout the Anatolia. We have enough evidence of that. And second, the basic aim was to assimilate. Kurds should forget their languages, Albanians should forget their culture, and so on. It is written in this document, and there are also regulations for each ethnic group. Some of them is published in recent publication in Turkish books. For example, there is a regulation for the resettlement of the Kurds, 11 point. Regulation for the resettlement of the Albanians, and so on. And in this regulation, it is in detailed advice to the local authorities how to resettle, for example, Kurds, and which policy should be implemented so that they should forget their languages and their cultural heritages, and so on. This is one basic element of the policy. It was the assimilation of non-Turkish Muslim population. And the second part was to expel the non-Muslims from Anatolia or to liquidate them, while the Armenians and Assyrians were targeted for annihilation. The Greeks were mostly driven out, started 1913. As a result, 1/3 of Anatolian population, which was 17 million at that time, 1/3 of these 17 million either relocated or killed. In A Shameful Act, you will follow this story step by step. This is what's about the book. So this is the first part of my speech. Now the second part is the security policy. and its relation to the denial policy. I'm often asked, and I gave a lot of lectures, why modern Turkey continues to deny the Armenian genocide. Why do we Turks feel as though lightning strikes our bones whenever the topic is mentioned? The Turks, I heard from Armenian friends a lot, my Turkish neighbor or my Turkish friend is a wonderful man, unless I open the topic Armenians. It changed totally. So why this total change in the attitude? There are several reasons for this, and I would like to elaborate on one of them here. And in Turkey, both genocide and its denial are framed in terms of national security. In 2005, when we organized the conference in Istanbul, there were demonstrators outside the street, and they had a placard in their hand. Soykırım değil, vatan savunması. It is not a genocide, it is defense of fatherland. The genocide and it is denial, understood, perceived by these people as something related with the defense of fatherland. My suggestion here is to take this argument very seriously and try to understand and analyze this, what is behind this defense of fatherland's argument. Because the Unionists and the Nationalists of that time and today denialists have all believed they were saving the Turkish fatherland from partition by the West by their policy. Any move towards facing the past, any attempt to open a discussion of historic wrongs has been denounced as a covert move in a master plan to partition Turkey. This tangle of past and present into a tight knot of self-defensiveness has its root in the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. From late Ottoman times to the present, there has been a continuous tension between the state's concern for secure border and society's need to come to terms with abuses of human rights. This tension has also given rise to divergent and mutually exclusive historical accounts. Dominating one side are the foundational works written by Ottomanist and Turkish historians, and on the other hand are the historical narratives of the minority groups, written by Armenians, Kurds, and so on. Greeks, you can continue like that. Until recently, the dominant narrative has been the story of the partition of the empire among the great powers, which ended with the empire's total collapse and disintegration. The fear of national obliteration loomed large during this period. The Ottomanist and Turkish historians scarcely mention the Christian people of the empire, neither as actors in the Ottoman social and political life, still less as the victims of massacres and other gross violations of human rights. Instead, especially in Turkish historiography, the Christian communities are painted as the seditious agents of the imperialist great powers, continually intriguing against the Turkish state. The ethnic and religious minorities, for their part, center themselves within a narrative of persecutions and massacres. The overall theme of this history is the community's maturation and national emergence, thanks in part to the benevolent intervention of the great powers. So we have a contradiction in the history, telling the history. On the one side, we see that the great powers inspired Turks an existential dread for their country, for their state, and among the minorities, this is the hope of national salvation for the suppressed nationalities. Great power intervention is very positive for the minorities because it's the hope, it is the salvation, and it is for the others, it is the end of everything because it means destruction of the empire. In this light, controversies about the Armenian genocide can be understood in part as the deployment of two apparently contradictory historical narratives against one another. Whenever the proponent of acknowledgement bring up a history of human rights abuses, they are confronted with an opposing narrative, that of decline and breakup of the Ottoman Empire. If you want, you can try. Any Armenian student in Harvard can go to a Turkish student and start a conversation. Armenian student will usually start telling the stories of horror, massacre, and killing, and he will get the answer, or she will get the answer from the other side, but the Ottoman Empire were partition, great powers, and so on. Two narratives has been used against each other in these, as if there were a contradiction there. So in Shameful Act, I show that these two narratives are not contradictory at all. They are two sides of the same coin, complementary perspectives on a single course of the human events. Both must be sufficiently understood and appreciated in order to grasp the ambiguities and contradiction of the Ottoman and Turkish history. There have been really certain moments in that history where national security of the state and human rights became inseparably intertwined. One such moment came immediately after the First World War, from 1918 to 1923. According to the general understanding in Turkey, this is how we taught in Turkish schools. This period, 1918-1923, is characterized as a war between the Turks, who desired after World War I to preserve their sole remaining territory as a legitimate successors of the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenians, Greeks, and the Kurds, who wanted to establish their own national state by partitioning Anatolia with the help of British, French, and Italians. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, essentially decided to partition in favor of the non-Turkish nationalities. For the Turks, therefore, Sèvres 1920 remains a black mark in our history. The Ottoman leaders who signed the agreement were sentenced to death as traitors by the nationalist movement in Anatolia. For the other nationalities, for the Armenians, Greeks, Kurds, although Sèvres did not fully reflect their demands for territory, the treaty represents an unprecedented historical opportunity to resolve issue in their favor. A similar positive attitude can be seen on the Turkish side in regard to the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923, which guaranteed the Turkish dominance on Anatolia. For the Turks, Lausanne stands as a milestone and validation of their continued national existence. Inversely, the other nationalities see this treaty as a great historical injustice. So, what we are going to do? Even though there is a way getting out from that conflict, I think. Even though contradictory assessment of Sèvres and Lausanne exist, the underlying logic is the same. Both sides regard the immediate post-war era as a period of struggle of territory. Should the Ottoman state retain its integrity and independence? Should new states be permitted to arise on the empire's former land? If so, how should the borders of these new states be defined? Which party is entitled to claim which territories? Historic land, Armenian, who said this is our land. The Turks who said we are governing this country centuries, and so on. So the main conflict is which territory belongs to which group. However, as I showed in A Shameful Act, territorial conflict are not the whole story of that period. There is another history of Sèvres and Lausanne, a human rights history which concerned the atrocities perpetrated by the Ottoman government against its Christian population during the World War I. From this perspective, the questions were and still are, what can be done about the wartime crimes against the Armenians? And the question was at that time, how should the perpetrators be punished? If we conceptualize the history along the axis of human rights and punishing the Turks, as they used in their documents of that period, punishing the Turks opens an entirely neglected dimension, namely the connection between Armenian genocide and foundation of Turkish Republic. The victorious powers agreed that the Turks had organized the massacres of other peoples, above all the Armenians. They counted Arabs, Kurds, and Greeks and Assyrians also. Thus, they argued, the Allied power, it was necessary to punish the Turks in order to rescue the minority groups from Turkish domination and prevent further massacres. This was the policy. Punishing the Turks had to be done in two phases. First was done by individually trying the members of the Ottoman government and other officials. The second was to limit the Turks to a state that would be as small, as weak as possible. I'm quoting from a telegram sent from Istanbul by Assistant High Commissioner British to Paris Peace Conference. Quote, in order to punish all of those persons who are guilty of the Armenian horrors, it is necessary to punish the Turks as a group. Therefore, I propose that the punishment be given on a national level through the partitioning up of the last Turkish Empire, and on a personal level by trying those high officials who are on the list in my possession, and in a manner that would serve as an example for their successors. End quote. The important question is following. What was the attitude of Turkish national movement regarding the punishment of perpetrators? In order to understand the events of time, you have to keep in mind that we had two governments. One in Istanbul, continuation of the Ottoman Empire, and the other in Ankara, new emerging national movement. In A Shameful Act, I demonstrated that both governments, Ankara Turkish nationalist movement and Istanbul government, acknowledged the massacres of Armenians and agreed with the Allied powers that the punishment should be done, but they were disagree in the scope and extent of retributive justice. Ankara and Istanbul thought punishment should be limited to the wartime leadership of the Union and Progress Party and the government officials who committed the crimes. These trials were termed as just and necessary. Both governments vehemently opposed the partition of Anatolia. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of Turkish Republic, condemned the wartime deportations and massacres of Armenians. He criticized the Union and Progress parties and it is pan-Turanistic, expansionist policy and pan-Islamistic policy, which dreamed the territorial expansion of the Ottoman Empire. In a conversation with the American General Harbert in 1919 September, who was assigned a possible US mandate over Armenia, Kemal said, quote, "We believe in the detrimental nature of Turanism. Turanizmin zararlarına inanıyoruz." In another memorandum, he characterized Turanism as a dangerous concept. The Ankara and Istanbul governments signed a protocol in October 1919, calling for an election of the Ottoman Parliament according to Ottoman Constitution. 5 protocols were signed between Ankara and Istanbul. The first protocol declared, I'm quoting, quote, "Ittihadism," this is the other name of Union and Progress Party, Party of Union and Progress Party, or any hint of its reawakening is politically very damaging. It is judicially and politically necessary to punish those who committed crimes in connection with the deportation. End quote. In a monumental speech of 1927, Kemal explained the reason of this policy and why they didn't also allow the Union and Progress Party officially participated in the election. He said, quote, "It would be improper for individuals who are connected to the evil deeds of the Unionists or persons who have been sullied by the nefarious acts of the deportation and massacre or other wicked actions that are contrary to the true interest of our nation." End quote. And so they didn't allow them to participate in the election. And his attitude can be summarized by these words when he spoke in Turkish parliament, and this is the title of my book. He called the Armenian massacres as a shameful act. Now, don't misunderstand me. Kemal was not a human rights activist. And he was not arguing all these for altruistic purposes. He was a politician, he was a nationalist, and leader of Turkish nationalist movement. As a nationalist and politician, he believed that the punishment of the perpetrator were the price of sovereignty. In a letter he stated when he wrote to Istanbul, 1920 January, he said that punishment, quote, should not stay only on paper, but should be carried out, since this would successfully impress the foreign elements. The basic aim was to impress the foreign elements in a way that the remaining territory of the Ottoman Empire can be secured. In short, it was accepted that the crimes were committed during the war, but that justice would be served on the leaders of it and members of the government according to Turkish domestic law. Meanwhile, the partition of Anatolia was firmly rejected, and the rationale for such an attitude was the expectation of more favorable result at the peace talks and desire to maintain the national border. So my central thesis is, I maintain that if the Allied had treated the territorial issues as separate from the punishment of individual perpetrators, we would be talking about quite a different history in Turkey today. This is not only a hypothetical speculation. As I show in A Shameful Act, there were circles among the Allied powers that advocated a different policy on the sovereignty of the Ottoman state. Unfortunately, the Allies' primary concern was not to punish crimes against humanity, but to partition Anatolia according to their own colonial interests. So, the interesting question is how the government's attitude changed. Why did Turkey begin by supporting retributive justice, Mustafa Kemal, supporting retributive justice, but end with supporting the suspects held by British and today's denial? The turning point was the Sevres Agreement. I quote again from a letter written by Mustafa Kemal. He sent this letter after the signing of Sevres Agreement to Istanbul. In August 1920, there were two other cases, two other Union and Progress Party members were hanged, and trials were going on, but Sevres was signed. Mustafa Kemal wrote to Istanbul a letter in which he said, quote, I have to find, "The Ottoman government continues to hang the children of the country for allegations of deportations and massacres, though these executions no longer have a meaning." End quote. Executions should only be carried out if they are meaningful, is what the line saying. Meaningless executions should be stopped, and it's stopped. The trials of war criminals were only partially realized because it became impossible to separate the issue of partitioning Anatolia from that of retributive justice against the perpetrators. This history has been erased from the national consciousness of the Turks because of another history. The military tribunal in Istanbul, which tried the perpetrator of the war crimes and the massacres, tried Mustafa Kemal also. The same court punished Mustafa Kemal to death penalty for its national resistance movement, and it was the same court punished the perpetrator of the genocide. It was the same court symbolizing both aspect of the history: sovereignty, national security, and punishment of the perpetrator. It is the symbol. So because sovereignty demand of the nationalist movement was not accepted, and this was the reason why Mustafa Kemal was sentenced by death penalty by this court, then in Turkish history writing, every remembrance to the persecutions of war criminals and massacres reminds them the history of partition. This is the reason why there is a conversation that both sides emphasize the different aspect of the story. I've tried to show that if the Western forces had taken the nationalist demand concerning the border seriously and had negotiated for trials in case of crimes against humanity in return, we might be talking about a very different history in Turkey. The Turkish nationalist movement was mainly shaped by the linkage between these two issues as national sovereignty concerns became paramount. The dimension of human rights was doomed to be forgotten. And this is the main reason that in modern Turkey, this aspect of history, including the Armenian genocide, has been consigned to oblivion. Restoring a human rights perspective to Turkish history reveals two important issues. First, Mustafa Kemal's condemnation of the Armenian massacres is diametrically opposed to the current official of Turkish policy of denial. Kemal's viewpoint during the difficult war years, although it is definitely not far enough from today's perspective or from our understanding, could be a positive starting point for Turkish government, at least to call it as a shameful act as Kemal did. Second, I think we need, because of that background, we need to rethink the Armenian-Turkish conflict. Until now, the problem has been perceived in terms of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the ethnic conflict over territory. I suggest that we have to reposition the Armenian-Turkish conflict within the new paradigm of transitional justice. This means as a part of democratization effort within existing nation states. The conflict should not be regarded as merely a dispute between two parties over territories and boundaries, but rather as a human rights issue between them. This can only be done if we patiently disentangle today the question of human rights abuses from the question of territory and national security. The question of territory should be considered as resolved and should remain closed. The question of human rights and rectifying the historic injustices remained unresolved and must be reopened. This is my central thesis. This view is unacceptable in Turkey, and the very term genocide has become contested, sacred to Armenians, taboo to Turks. Both sides attached supreme importance to the word genocide. Let me clear. According to United Nations definition, what happened in 1915 can be called genocide, nothing else. But please allow me, this is my last point, as an outsider and as a dissident, to raise another argument. In fact, I believe the word genocide, or G word, is a distraction, a complete red herring. The real issue lies elsewhere. Let me explain. The word genocide denotes a crime under international law. When you argue about whether the term genocide applies in specific cases, you are presupposing that a crime was committed. You compare one type of crime with other types of crimes and decide which label to apply. Genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, and so on. So, only after we established that a crime was committed can we discuss what type of crime it was. And my argument is, in Turkey, we have not arrived at this point, and this is not the point of discussion in Turkey. The conflict is not about, today, This is my central argument. The conflict today is not about which label to apply. There is no presupposition that what happened in 1915 was any type of crime. Turkish denial thesis maintains that the state had the right to relocate its own people. There is nothing wrong with it. If some of the deportees perished, that was a tragedy, but not a crime. Therefore, no moral or legal condemnation is necessary. So, what we are missing in this issue is the moral dimension of the problem. The fundamental issue is not the definition of a term. What needs to be re-emphasized in this entire discussion is the moral condemnation of an act. Only after a moral condemnation, only agreeing that a crime had taken place, we can discuss what kind of crime it was. A Shameful Act is an appeal to Turkish people to accept this moral responsibility. Thank you for listening.
If all of you could please just pass your note cards to Mark, or in the middle of the aisle, we're going to have a couple people pick them up, and then we're going to just randomly choose and do about half an hour of questioning, and then we'll head to the lobby for the book selling and signing. So if you could just pass them like this way and this way, we'll pick them up. Thank you.
Quite a few. Well, I'll start.
It's warm here.
It's warm. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. First question, Dr. Akçam. How can an Armenian speak to a Turk on this issue in a way that will not cause the other party to become defensive and lead to productive dialogue?
If I knew the answer. For me, the most important thing is readiness to listen. If it's a Turk, Armenian, it doesn't matter. The basic question in all reconciliation process that to ready to accept, to listen, try to understand the pain of the others. If there is no such a readiness, there is no tactic that you can implement. Whatever tactic an Armenian uses won't help if there is no readiness on the other side to listen and to share the pain and to develop a common language and common understanding of a basic human pain. Basic problem is whether or not this Turk or the other Armenian, this human being, is ready to condemn and human rights abuses. Moral standard, a limited, this is the minimal moral standard that we have to establish, and this is the beginning of everything. So condemnation of a wrongdoing, condemnation of a human rights abuses, and having a moral standard being against any sort of massacres or mass killings against individuals or groups, from which nationality, which ethnic group, it's not important, is the basis of such a conversation. If there is not there, if you have met somebody who argues that the territory is more important than the people who lives on there, you cannot go ahead from there. If territory is more important than the human lives, this is what's happened in Darfur, this is what happened in Rwanda, this is what happened to Armenians, and so on. The basic idea is there is a state, and it's right of this state, and territory and land is more important than the people living on this territory. This is the basic human problem that we face.
Would you be random with the questions as you promised? Selecting them?
Yeah, we're just trying to see the ones that we
I
can
think you
read.
were selecting them.
No, actually, I'm trying to see if I can read the handwriting.
Dr. Akçam. Question. The questioner is wondering why Ottomans chose to deport and/or massacre Armenians and/or Assyrians in eastern Turkey, but not Armenians living in other parts of Turkey or Greeks and Jews.
According to the Ottoman documents, beginning 1913, Armenian came in the picture very late. There were a general plan, what I call demographic policy, to homogenize Anatolia, and this plan was described in Turkish memoirs. If you read the memoirs of Celal Bayar, the third Turkish president, he was in charge in Smyrna, Izmir region for the expulsion of the Greek population. If you read the memoirs of Halil Menteşe, he was foreign minister, parliament president, justice minister, and member of Union and Progress Party Central Committee. They all described, or Kuşçubaşı Eşref, another important name, he was one of the field operator of Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa. You can get a knowledge what the plans were, and these were first implemented in Western Anatolia. 1913 March, for example, from Eastern Thrace, or according to us, the west of Turkey, first the Greeks were deported into Greece, and beginning of 1914, spring months, the Greeks were removed from their villages. There were massacres, killings, plunderings, but the main target was not the annihilation of the Greek population. And according to Turkish sources, Halil Menteşe, for example, the parliament president, gives the number 200,000 only for the year of 1914. There are different numbers on that. So the plan was implemented against the Greeks in Western Anatolia, and the basic aim was to remove them from these villages, and then the Muslim immigrants who were coming from Balkan were resettled in these villages. So it was not only the Armenians, it was the Greeks, started with the Greeks. And for the question, answer to the question, even Jews were relocated from Jerusalem, which, according to Ottoman documents, who asked this question, I would recommend him to read Fuat Dündar's book, published by İletişim Yayınları in Istanbul, I think 2002, if I'm not wrong, or 2001 must be the publishing year. He detailed all documents of relocation of all ethnic groups in Anatolia, and Jewish population were also relocated because of political reason by 3rd Army Commander Cemal Pasha towards two different directions. One is towards Halep, north of Aleppo, and the other is towards inside of Anatolia, and the number of Jews is more than 5,000 who were relocated from that region. So Armenians were not only deported from eastern provinces. If you read the published Ottoman documents, 1995, the Devlet Arşivleri Genel Müdürlüğü, the General Directorate of Turkish General Archives, published a volume, Osmanlı belgelerinde Armenians, the Armenians in Ottoman documents. If you read only this published book by Turkish state, you will see the name of the cities and provinces from which the Armenians were deported. Armenians were deported from all over Anatolia, from Edirne to Muğla, from Kastamonu to Bolu. There were certain places where Armenians not deported, but this is a topic of another discussion of my demographic policy theory, because there were a social engineering behind all this relocation policy. The Ottoman authorities, when they relocated non-Muslims or non-Turkish Muslim population, they had an order. The new population arrived in the region should not exceed 5 or 10% of the indigenous population. There were some regions, for example, the number of Armenians were not exceeding 5 or 10%, and Talat sent a telegram to that region saying that the Armenian is not exceeding this level, they can remain in that region. There are certain provinces, for example, in that provinces they distributed the Armenians within the same province. They sent this, is, for example, to Kocaeli, saying that the Armenians should be distributed within the provinces in a way so that their number to the overall population in that province should be less than 5 and 10%. So it was not only against Armenian, it was a population policy. The important question is actually why it has this extramonetary character, character of annihilation against Armenian. Why not against the Greeks in that way? Against the Greek after 1919, 1920. This is the Pontus Greek, it's another history. But during the war years, Greek population were mostly saved from deportation, and they only relocated within the Anatolia itself, from the coastal region, the inside of Anatolia, and they could come back 1918. I'm working on this topic, that's why I can give hours and hours talking on that issue, only based on Ottoman documents, not on the other archival materials, full of materials, but we can take the Ottoman materials also as basis. So it was a demographic policy against all ethnic groups, and it was mostly detrimental and exterminatory against Armenians.
I'm going to slightly summarize this question because it's a little bit lengthy, but to the questioner, it is clear to infer from your writings during the last 30 years that you are against any policy of Turkey. Does your bias against Turkey prevent you from providing scientific, objective research on the Turkish-Armenian issue?
There's one sentence quote only. Can you just also provide that? It is quoted from an internet website.
In 1976, Dr. Akçam was arrested and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He escaped prison 1 year later. True?
It's written in book. It is. It's at the cover page of Shameful Act also. Of course, I was prisoner of conscience. 1976, I was arrested and punished to 8 years, 9 months, 20 days. And after 1 year, I escaped to Germany. I got political asylum. Since 1995, I'm German citizen. And the articles were removed from Turkish Penal Code. This was the infamous Article 141, 142. These articles were taken from Italy, from Mussolini fascist regime, 1936. And these articles were removed Turkish Penal Code on the way of Turkey's accession to the European Union. And this was related to two different topics. One was related to they call it communist propaganda. Actually, the article, the Penal Code article banned mentioning existing social classes in Turkey and mentioning existing class struggle in Turkey. I was sentenced because of an article that I wrote, and I mentioned the struggle of the workers in Istanbul. I can provide this article also if you want. A group of workers were in strike in Istanbul and demanding the trade union rights. And we as students wrote this in our journal, and because of that article I was punished to 8 years, 9 months, 20 months. And there are another Penal Code article. It was also against the mentioning of existing Kurds in Turkey, and it was punishable at that time, and they were all removed from Turkish Penal Code. And so my bias against Turkish state, I don't have any bias against Turkish state. Why should I have against anybody or any person bias? You can see but my history as a part of human rights activity in Turkey, as a part of Turkey's democratization process. I can give you one more example. Maybe I take your time for that, but I have to give you. Because last time there are a lot of campaign against me going on, that I'm a terrorist and so on. In one of these web pages, it is really very sad. I have to tell you this story. In one of these web pages, Tall Armenians Tale or whatever, they have good connection with Turkish security services, I understand. They put 5 events for my terrorist activities. I was really arrested by police, 1974-75. I forgot the dates, the name. I forgot that because in the student activities it was known. 4-5 events. I will tell you the story. It's very important. They put in their web pages to prove my being a terrorist. Look this. If you think a terrorist has a gun, fights, kills, you know why I was arrested at that time? Can you ever imagine to distribute a flyer, getting the permission from Turkish police was a reason to be arrested? One of these cases was our student association was against Cyprus invasion. Turkish army Cyprus invasion. I was against that, 1974. We distributed a flyer. But in order to distribute a flyer in Turkey, you have to go to police and you have to give your name, address, and under each flyer there must be your address and name also. We distributed this flyer, getting permitted from Turkish state, and I was held in police 4 days. This was one of my terrorist activities. And these people who are organizing the campaign cannot write their names when they distribute flyers in CUNY in New York at the universities. They cannot write their names. They are so scared because they are not honest with themselves. Yes, I was arrested 1974-75, 4 or 5 times, each of time because of distributing flyers and getting the permission were taken from the Turkish police. But it's easy to attack people, and it's a very well-known strategy, not the ideas. If you cannot handle with the demographic policy based on Ottoman documents, you have to attack the individual. This is a very well-known strategy, and I really ashamed with this sort of critique.
Do you have anything else you want to confess to while you're here? If you pose that the issues after the genocide were national security and human rights, and that national security took precedence, what explains why modern-day Turkey, whose territory is not threatened, continues to deny what took place more than 90 years ago? Why is modern Turkey still threatened by this today?
It's a very important question, and and really we have to, the Turkish intellectuals in Turkey, we have to discuss more in Turkey, and arguing that Turkish national security concept must include the human rights abuses in the past and today, because this is the basic problem of our security. We have the security problem because we ignore the existence of Kurds. We have the security problem because we ignore the existence of Armenian genocide. This is the important connection. If you listen to Turkish General Staff, Büyükanıt, when he came to Washington, even though the questionnaire said that Turkey's land is not threatened, Turkey has no security problem, he gave a speech in Washington saying that Turkey resembles 1919. And it is exactly the same days when Mustafa Kemal went to Samsun and started the National Liberation War. He argues that we are still under the same condition. And we Turks, intellectuals, liberals, when we say that the Turkey should face its own history, they understand this as a threat against Turkish national security. And exactly the same argument they made to the Kurdish question, saying that if we acknowledge the North Iraq entity as such, it is a threat to Turkey and it is a part of Turkish national security. So our argument must be a national security concept which considered the human being as a threat to its own existence is a wrong security concept and create more problem for that country. It is the origin of the problem, not the people, not the Kurds. So this is an important connection, and there are people in Turkey, nationalists, and there is a new rising nationalist tide in Turkey. There are really a fascist movement in Turkey. They firmly believe what they are doing is, they call it a second national liberation movement. They think that we are just on the edge of partition and we have to fight against traitors like Taner Akçam and others who don't think we have to kill them if necessary. This is the mindset there, and it is important to understand and to challenge this national security concept. That this is my appeal to Washington also, a national security concept in the Middle East, which excludes the human groups and nations, is a threat for the stability in the region. And we have to change this concept, and Turkey must change this concept in order to be a democratic country.
Dr. Akçam, if you say that the intent of the government was genocide, why then did they bother conducting relocation?
We can ask a lot of this sort of hypothetical question. Why, if the target was the annihilation of entire Armenian population, why then so many Armenians survived? This is the other question. If a government, they argue, want to kill the Armenians, they could have done it on the spot and killed them entirely. It's a naive question, because you are not cutting vegetables. You are killing human beings. It's a very hard process, you know. Have you ever compared the different genocide and the number of deaths in each genocide? For us, the ultimate case is the Holocaust. How many percent of Jewish population were killed by Hitler under Hitler's occupation territory? What is the number? You know that? Not 60%. I mean, the estimate is around 50%, 55%. The highest level of the killing of a group of population is the Rwandan, 80%, 1995. You cannot kill, even though you have the intention, the entire population as such. So, in Armenian genocide, the estimate is around 50-55% also. Which numbers you take, it is 50-55%. Take the Armenian account, take the Turkish account. But why then the decision of deportation? Why the other ways? They could have, I cannot read the mind of Talat and Enver, but the basic idea was to create within the Anatolia a homogeneous Muslim Turkish population. And you cannot kill the entire Armenian population in their spot, because you have allied like Germany and other governments, and you have to keep something, hide something. There were orders not to kill Armenians within the cities. The killings order were related only deportation convoys on their ways and certain spots. There is a case, Diyarbakir Governor Dr. Rashid, he killed the Armenians and the other Christians within the city. And the number of Armenians and the other Christians exceed 2,000, more than 2,000 within 1-2 weeks. And the German chancellor in the province and the American missionaries, they get furious. I mean, in the city they were seeing. And then they telegrammed, one telegram after another. And Talat sent a telegram to Dr. Rashid saying that, first of all, our political and military measures is not against all Christians, only against Armenians. It says that don't kill the others, only the Armenians. And second, don't kill anybody within the city borders. Because then outside the city you have the cover-up strategies always. You can say that it is the war condition, it is the weathering, it is this and that. But the government is responsible. In every genocide, you have always one common element. The perpetrator try to cover up their criminal act. And this was the method, what they found out, because they don't have the bureaucracy, they don't have this mechanism to kill everybody. Most of the Armenians were not killed by Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa unit. They perished in deserts. This was the way of that they thought that they could implement exclusively, sending them into desert, leave them there, and they can die for itself. Because of the anti-deportation was a very old Ottoman tactics because of that reason.
Dr. Akçam, what is the response in Turkey to your book, and are you in danger if you go to Turkey?
A Shameful Act actually originally published in Turkish. In 1999, the name of the book is İnsan Hakları ve Ermeni Sorunu, Human Rights and Armenian Question, because my basic argument is to open the human rights question again. Published 1919, made a second edition in 2000, and is still available in Turkey in bookstores. But Shameful Act is a revised edition of that. In the Turkish version, I was not able to work in Başbakanlık Arşivi in Ottoman archives in Istanbul. I used mostly the documents of the trials, Istanbul trials. In A Shameful Act, you will see new chapters, new documents, especially from Ottoman archives, and basically related to the demographic policy. This is an extension, and in A Shameful Act, the part of Revenge Act, Armenians Revenge Act, is more than in Turkish one. There is an extension here in Shameful Act. Whether my life is in danger, everyone who follows up Turkish newspaper can answer this question. Turkish intellectuals and journalists, more than 10, they are under police protection now. Elif Shafak can hardly go out from her house. Any other important journalists, Can Dündar, İsmet Berkan, Murat Belge, every almost known intellectual are under police protection because their life is threatened. And I have a very secure position in the United States, but I can go to Turkey as long as I'm not in a very certain place in public and stay there for a long time. There won't be a big problem. If I travel as a tourist, for example, it won't be a problem.
Dr. Akçam, why do you regard the post-war trials of Ottoman leaders as legitimate? Weren't these show trials for the Allies and lacking in due process and so forth?
Have you ever compared the Istanbul trials with Nuremberg trials, or with the trials in military tribunal in Tokyo, or International Criminal Court in Den Haag now, or the Saddam trials? I think all trials with this capacity are political trials. Nuremberg was also one. You can never separate politique from justice or from law. In that case, Istanbul trials was also a product of Allied policy. I mean, not direct policy, but it has related to the political circumstances of that period. There are two important reasons we have to know why Istanbul trials are important, not the political nature. But if you discuss the political nature of the trials, you will discover something very awkward, very funny, you cannot believe. The prisoners could leave the prison anytime that they wanted. Can you imagine? They wrote in their memoirs. Dr. Reşit, Diyarbakır governor, wrote in memoir. Tevfik Rüştü Aras, Turkish foreign minister between 1924 and 1938. He wrote in his memoir saying that I was leaving anyone who wants to leave the prison could leave. We always came back because we never thought that we could stay longer there. So it was a show process politically for that time, not for the Union and Progress Party, because they really never felt threatened themselves. They controlled the justice system in a way, and it was really, this is the reason why British never believed the seriousness of these trials, because of the strength, political strength of Union and Progress Party. And second important reason, for us, the political aspect of the trials are not so important. For us, important aspect, of course it's important, we can discuss, and so the important things that for the genocide is the documentation, the documents, the eyewitness accounts, testimonies, and the original documentation that presented in that trial. Now, you have two basic problems in these trials, in Nuremberg, in every trial. First of all, whether or not the documents used are original documents. State documents are original. That's why, for example, it was known by court, and the court sent each and every document that they used in their trials to the related ministry, and they get a confirmation. Yes, it confirms the originality. Only they use the documents which they can prove as original. The second important thing in this sort of trials are whether the testimony accounts are taken under torture or voluntarily. I know that from the military tribunal after 1980 in Turkey, almost each and every single testimony was taken by torture. So in 1919, we know that they prepared their eyewitness accounts and testimonies and defense together. Boğazlayan Kaymakamı Kemal, who was hanged, I think 19th April 1919 in Istanbul, his defense was written collectively. The entire prisoner were coming together, discussing, and they were holding the important person from the Justice Ministry. Halil Mendeşe wrote in his memoirs. I wrote for him. I mean, there were such a freedom for them, and there were no single sign of torture that we should doubt about the authenticity of these eyewitness accounts. So as long as we can use this documentation from these trials, there is no problem for us, because for us the important part is whether this trial were justice or not. Important is whether or not we can use the documentation from these trials for our historical analysis.
Okay, the last question, just in respect for time. If Turkey is admitted into the EU, will this give them a type of national security which may open up communications for admitting the genocide?
First of all, maybe I have to repeat again, I don't think that Turkey has a national security problem. Turkey has one of the biggest army in the Middle East, and Turkey's problem is not being aware of its own strength. It's a very powerful country, and he only come out from this nation-state-based thinking in the region. And there are, maybe it's a long discussion, but there are certain signs of it. The ex-president of Turkish Geheimdienst, for example, in a conference organized by Kurds in Ankara, openly said that Turkey must change the national security concept because we have to include the Kurds in our national security concept. So one aspect is that Turkey has no serious, it's very amazing. When I was in Greece, in Syria, I mean, I grew up as a kid always being afraid of the neighbors. They were coming. Greeks, Syrians, Armenians, they were all coming. They carve our country. This is how we grow up. And I went to Greek, they were afraid of Turkey. What? From me? Yes, you are coming and you will invite to all islands and you will take, if you go to church, oh, Turkey, they will take the Mosul and Kirkuk, the North Iraq. This is very important. It makes the one point very clear. History is still a very important stumbling block. As long as they don't talk openly this history with each other, they still continue to afraid, and it's a stupid thing. It is very stupid to afraid from each other, and they can understand, and they will see that not this national security concept is totally wrong and is a product of 100 years ago, and it must change, period. There is no such a serious problem. But exactly the European Union is an important guarantee for Turkey, and European Union also an important factor for Turkey is acknowledging the historic wrongdoings. This is what I believe. Until 2015 is the official date of Turkey's admission to European Union. We don't know whether it will happen or not. There are a lot of other political factors there. But if it happens, one important element that is repeated again and again, that Turkey must face its own history. And there are enough resolutions of European Parliament, and it will give Turkey really a secure basis to acknowledge these historic wrongdoings. But before that one, I can only repeat one thing that Hrant was emphasizing all the time. Hrant was saying that actually 1915 and history is not a big stumbling block in Turkey. The basic problem, the Turkish ruling elite's policy towards the state of Armenia today. Because they don't want to develop diplomatic relations, because they want to keep the border closed, they use the history as a tool in their policy today. So before solving the historical problems was for Hrant, the essential thing is to establish diplomatic relations between Turkey and Armenia without any precondition. If, he always said, if these both people come together, talk to each other, they know what happened. Go to Eastern Turkey today. Talk to people. They know what happened. They can show you in their families, Armenians, my grandma, my granddad, and so on. In every family. They talk it openly. They know that. And Hrant's argument that if they come together, hayvanlar koklaşa koklaşa, insanlar konuşa konuşa. This is a Turkish way of saying the animals smell each other and the human being talks to each other. This is how they solve their problems.
Okay, this concludes our question and answer. And just to let you all know, all of the questions that were written on the note cards we will be giving them to Dr. Akçam. I'm now going to ask Nancy Koligyan to come up, the board chairman of NAASR, to say some couple of closing words. And after that, please feel free to stop in the lobby and pick up a copy of A Shameful Act. And Dr. Akçam will be there signing it as well. Thank you.
NAASR and our co-sponsors, I'd like to thank Dr. Akçam for his passion, his humanity, and his bravery and his strong sense of consciousness. And we are really honored to have you here with us this evening. I know that you're anxious to purchase his book outside and get it signed, so I will not keep you here. But if you would just allow Dr. Akçam to go outside before we all get up, then he can position himself. Again, we thank you so much and wish you all the best. Thank you all for being here.